Hello, everyone. She did not walk the runway. She danced across it like a flame in silk. Pat Cleveland was not just a model. She was movement, music, magic. In an era where Black beauty was barely allowed in the room, she turned every step into resistance. She spun, she twirled, she lit up Paris and New York with a smile that could melt steel. But while the world saw freedom, she was fighting for permission, to be seen, to be accepted, to exist in an industry that called her exotic and tried to keep her on the margins. She once said, "I did not want to be the first Black anything. I just wanted to be me." So how did Pat Cleveland become one of the most celebrated and forgotten pioneers in fashion? And why did she have to leave America just to be loved? Pat Cleveland was born in 1950 in New York City, into a world that was both creatively rich and racially complicated. Her mother, Lady Bird Cleveland, was a Harlem-based artist and a fiercely independent woman who raised Pat on her own. They lived modestly, surrounded by paints, poetry, and struggle. Her father, a jazz saxophonist of Swedish descent, left before she was old enough to remember his voice. It was just Pat and her mother, living in a city that offered art on every corner, but few guarantees. From an early age, Pat absorbed the rhythm of Harlem and the elegance of uptown. She was tall, bright-eyed, and theatrical, drawn to music, dance, and fantasy. In a world that often tried to limit Black girls, she imagined herself as someone impossible to contain. Her mother taught her to dress creatively, to move with grace, to never apologize for color or imagination. She wore homemade gowns to school and spoke in musical phrases. Some kids called her strange, others called her magical. She did not try to fit in. She floated above it. Pat dreamed of becoming a fashion designer. At 16, she studied fashion illustration and spent her time sketching dresses and reading fashion magazines in the library. She did not see many faces like hers in those pages, but she kept reading anyway. Her discovery came unexpectedly. While riding the subway, a fashion editor noticed her and invited her to a photo shoot. That shoot changed her life. Soon after, she was signed to a modeling agency and began appearing in magazines like Ebony and Essence. But even as her career started, she was constantly reminded of her difference. Clients loved her energy, but hesitated to book her for mainstream campaigns. Editors praised her grace, but always added the word exotic. She was allowed to shine, but only within boundaries. Still, Pat refused to shrink. She brought performance to every shoot, turning fashion into theater. She was not posing. She was telling stories with her body. She once said that she danced down the runway because standing still felt like surrender. And behind every twirl, every smile, every dramatic exit, there was a girl from Harlem raised by a mother who taught her to live out loud. Pat Cleveland's journey did not begin in fame. It began in survival, in creativity, and in a dream so vivid that it demanded to be seen. Pat Cleveland did not enter modeling quietly. From the beginning, she refused to be ordinary. Her first real break came in 1966 when she was just 16 years old. After being spotted on a subway platform by an assistant to Vogue editor Carrie Donovan, she was invited to a fashion event at Ebony magazine. That invitation turned into a photo shoot. That photo shoot turned into a ripple. Suddenly, Pat was appearing in pages that had once felt closed to women like her. But as her image began circulating, she ran straight into the brick wall of American fashion's racial barriers. Editors loved her energy, designers praised her elegance, but few were willing to place a Black model in the center of a high fashion spread. She was booked, but never featured. She was admired, but always with a footnote. Behind the compliments was a silent ceiling she could not break. No matter how dazzling she was, the gatekeepers still treated her as novelty, not necessity. Still, she kept showing up. She glided into rooms where no one expected her to belong, wearing homemade gowns and an unshakable smile. She spun instead of walking. She sang on set. She refused to shrink to fit anyone's comfort. Pat brought performance to every appearance, not because she was trying to entertain, but because she knew she had to fight for space. Every movement was a declaration. I am here. I matter. You will see me. But even her magic had limits. After an incident at a casting where she overheard a stylist say they would never put a Black model on the cover of a major magazine, she made a decision that would change everything. If America would not love her, she would go somewhere that would. In the early 1970s, she packed her bags and moved to Paris. There, everything shifted. European designers like Karl Lagerfeld, Yves Saint Laurent, and Kenzo embraced her without hesitation. They loved her fluidity, her theatricality, her refusal to stand still. In Paris, she was not a risk, she was a revelation. And once she began walking the couture shows, it became clear that Pat Cleveland was not just a model. She was a muse. She did not need permission anymore. She had crossed the ocean and found her freedom. What America overlooked, Europe celebrated. And what once looked like exile became the beginning of her empire. In Paris, Pat Cleveland was not just accepted. She was exalted. Her runway presence, once treated as excessive in America, was now seen as revolutionary. She became the favorite of designers who understood that fashion was not just fabric and form, it was theater, it was spirit, and no one embodied that spirit more than Pat. She walked for Yves Saint Laurent, Karl Lagerfeld, Kenzo, and Thierry Mugler, not with the stiff and practiced glide of the traditional runway, but with the flourish of a dancer. She twirled, she smiled, she tossed her arms in the air like every step was a celebration. Audiences did not just watch her, they reacted to her. She made people feel, and that feeling became her brand. In 1973, she was chosen to walk in the now legendary Battle of Versailles fashion show, an unprecedented event that pitted American designers against the French elite in a high-profile fashion duel. Pat was one of the few Black models included in the American lineup, alongside other rising stars like Bethan Hardison and Billy Blair. She did not just walk that night, she lit the stage on fire. Her performance helped redefine the perception of American fashion. It also helped redefine what it meant to be a Black model on a global stage. The show was a turning point, not just for fashion, but for Pat's legacy. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, she was everywhere. She appeared in Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Interview. She worked with Warhol, Avedon, and Helmut Newton. She was the muse behind collections, editorials, and campaigns. Her image was immortalized in paintings, prints, and Polaroids. But it was not just her face that people remembered. It was the motion, the life, the way she refused to walk like anyone else. Pat's influence went beyond style. She challenged the quietness that was expected of Black women in high fashion. She was bold, she was joyful, she was dramatic, and she was unapologetically visible. In doing so, she created a blueprint for the models who would come after her, from Naomi Campbell to Alec Weck to Jordan Dunn. They did not just inherit the runway, they inherited her courage. At her peak, Pat Cleveland was not just a supermodel. She was a performer, a pioneer, a portal through which fashion became something more than beautiful. It became alive. Pat Cleveland's rebellion was never loud. It was lyrical. While others marched or shouted, she spun and smiled and glided through closed doors that were never meant to open for her. She did not just refuse to conform. She refused to stand still long enough to be categorized. Her defiance came through joy, and that made it even more radical. In an industry that often treated Black models as accessories to white collections, Pat made herself the center of every room she entered. She did not wait for permission to be expressive. She danced down the runway long before it was acceptable. She talked openly about race and beauty when silence was expected. She refused to apologize for the shape of her lips, the shade of her skin, or the volume of her presence. One of her boldest acts of rebellion came not on stage, but in her choices. She left the American fashion scene at the height of her career because it would not celebrate her fully. She chose Paris, not just for opportunity, but for dignity. That was not ambition, that was survival. She turned exile into elevation. She turned rejection into art. She also refused to be boxed into the narrative of the tragic token. She was not here to be one of few. She wanted more doors open. She used her interviews, her appearances, her very body as a form of resistance. She wore colors no one expected. She styled her own looks. She infused every shoot with theater and story. She did not just sell fashion, she embodied feeling. Pat also spoke openly about aging in fashion. Long before inclusivity became a trend, she kept modeling into her 40s, 50s, and 60s, challenging an industry that worships youth but fears time. She walked with silver hair, with deeper lines, with the same energy she had in her 20s. She once said, "I will dance until I fall. And even then, I will dance on the ground." Her rebellion was not just for herself. It was for every woman who had been told to be less dramatic, less visible, less everything. Pat Cleveland never gave them less. She gave them more. And in doing so, she changed not just the way we look at models, but the way we think about joy as protest. Pat Cleveland never had a dramatic fall. There were no scandals, no public breakdowns, no humiliating tabloid headlines. But her absence was still felt. As the fashion world transitioned into the 1990s, with new faces and changing tastes, Pat began to slip quietly out of the spotlight. The industry that once celebrated her movement began favoring minimalism, blank stares, and youth. Her theatricality was suddenly too much, her joy too loud. She did not stop working. She simply stepped away from the front row. She focused on her family, raising her daughter Anna, who would later follow in her footsteps. She spent time painting, writing, and occasionally modeling for designers who still remembered the fire she brought. But the world at large, the one that once danced when she entered a room, seemed to forget her. Or perhaps it was simply not ready to keep remembering. In 2019, Pat faced a life-threatening illness. While attending Paris Fashion Week, she was rushed to the hospital and underwent emergency surgery for colon cancer. The diagnosis was severe, and the silence around it was even more so. She had to start a GoFundMe campaign to afford treatment, a shocking reality for someone who had helped build modern fashion's DNA. The headlines were quiet. The industry's support was minimal. And suddenly, the vibrant woman who once owned the runway was battling for her life and for recognition. But even illness could not dull her defiance. She recovered. She walked again. She appeared in campaigns with her daughter. And she did it all without bitterness. Pat never complained about the silence. She danced through it. She said once that life is just another stage. And she would keep performing for as long as the curtain was open. Still, the wound remained. The world she gave so much to had not truly honored her. Not the way it should have. Not the way it promised it would. She had broken barriers, opened doors, and reshaped an industry. Yet when she needed it most, the applause had already moved on. Pat Cleveland never fell from grace, but the grace she gave was not always returned. And perhaps that is the quiet tragedy of brilliance. It lights the path for others, even if it leaves you in the shadow. Pat Cleveland may not have statues or fashion schools named after her, but her legacy lives in movement. It lives in the way the runway became a place of story, of color, of rhythm. She taught the world that modeling was not stillness, it was poetry. It was power in motion. She did not fight the system with anger. She challenged it with joy. And in doing so, she changed the definition of elegance. She made it wild. She made it alive. She made it unapologetically hers. Every time a model steps onto a catwalk and does more than walk when she spins, When she smiles, when she dares to perform, that is Pat. When a woman of color takes center stage without explanation or compromise, that is Pat. When age is not hidden, but honored, that is Pat. She once said, "I wanted to dance through life like it was one long runway." And she did, even when the lights faded, even when the crowd quieted. She kept moving. In a world that forgets too easily, Pat Cleveland's greatest act of rebellion was to be unforgettable. Not because of controversy, not because of fame, but because she turned her very existence into art. So ask yourself, when was the last time fashion made you feel something real? If you remember the moment, chances are she was already there.